Hello, and welcome to, I think, the inaugural Free Speech Union lecture. We haven't actually used this format before, but we're very lucky tonight in that Professor Jennings is going to give us a lecture entitled On Liberty and Tyranny, Lessons from Alexis de Tocqueville and Stuart Mill. That'll be 30 to 40 minutes, and then I'll pop back up here and ask Jeremy some questions, and then we'll throw it out to a Q&A. In addition to welcoming you all tonight, I just wanted to remind everyone, if they're not already members of the Free Speech Union, then you can join. You should find one of these lying around or on your way out. Just click the QR code and that'll take you to the join page. Very cheap. In addition, we've now, I think, made tickets to our next event, which is me talking to Nigel Farage on stage at the Hippodrome, I think available to members and non-members alike. Is that right, Jan? Or do you have to be a member to buy one? Anybody can get one. They're 25 quid. And that is on, when is it? October the 11th? The 9th, October the 9th. So yeah, next Monday at the Hippodrome. Anyway, our speaker tonight is Jeremy Jennings, who is the emeritus, as of 2 days ago, Professor of Political Theory at King's College London. His research focuses upon the history of political thought in France, and his latest book, which we hope to have on sale, but we don't, because there was a screw up with the bookshop, but it's Travels with Tocqueville, Beyond America. And it's an excellent book. I reviewed it for The Spectator back in March. And what Jeremy does in this book is introduce people to the thought of Tocqueville by retracing his footsteps on his various foreign excursions to Switzerland, Algeria, but principally America. Anyway, highly recommended. Jeremy has worked at numerous UK universities, including Oxford, Swansea, Birmingham, and Queen Mary, and he holds visiting professorship with the National Foundation of Political Science in Paris. But I really can't think of anyone better to talk to us tonight about Tocqueville and Mill. Take it away, Jeremy.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you, Toby and the Free Speech Union, for inviting me to give the inaugural lecture to you. It's a great honour and a great privilege. And like you, I'm sure I enjoy reading the weekly summaries of the activities of the Free Speech Union and the remarkable things that they are doing, not just in this country, but around the world, to protect and defend largely individuals who find themselves the victims of arbitrary power of one sort or the another. So I'm very pleased to be with you this evening. This is the topic of my lecture. I'm going to begin with, it's going to be a bit of a romp actually to get through all of what I want to say in the time available to me, and I'll therefore leave, I'm sure, lots and lots of things open, and anyone who knows anything about these two thinkers will no doubt be able to accuse me of inaccuracies of one sort or the another, but I'll try and get to through the basic points that I want to make as best I can and as speedily as I can. But I'm going to as this is an inaugural lecture, I'm actually going to begin with a sort of historical backdrop to this. Because part of my thesis is that something quite dramatically happens around the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, and the focus of attention turns away from what was seen as a form of repression, namely repression by the state, to repression by public opinion. And I think that's what I want to focus on. So I'm going to go back a little bit through the 17th, 18th centuries, French Revolution and so on, just by way of just some sort of background to this, at least. And the opening point is to say that, roughly speaking, again, roughly speaking, all this is roughly speaking, prior to the 16th century, no state willingly accepted the existence of two religions within its boundaries. That was a simple, that was sort of given, and therefore any religious minority was subject to violent repression of one sort or another. The first step in, I guess, the crack of that sort of universe was the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which you might not have heard of before, but this accepted that within the Holy Roman Empire, we won't talk about that, rulers could decide which religion would operate in their territory. And it could only be either Lutheranism or Catholicism. And that if X lived within the territory where the prince decided it was going to be Protestant, they had to be Protestant, although they were allowed the opportunity to emigrate. And this was an application of the Roman law principle, namely what pleases the prince has the force of law. But this was some advance because it did say we could be Protestant here or Catholic there. This didn't obviously last very long because of the Counter-Reformation, and think of things like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and so on and so forth. And then subsequently the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, which roughly speaking killed about 7 million people across Europe in the name of religion. However, the basic principles of the Peace of Augsburg were re-established with the Treaty of Westphalia, which you've probably all heard of, but this added Calvinism to Catholicism and Lutheranism as options for the prince to adopt. And in addition, subjects were within limits, given the right to practice a religion of their choice. So you can see another little step. But still the basic principle was that a state had the right to decide what people believed. And saying partly this is from the justified fear of civil war, because the wars of religion, etc. I mean, this is what had characterized European history for a century or more. People drew the lesson that, therefore, one religion was a good thing because at least it prevented civil war. And if you want an example of this, unfortunately I don't have it for you, but it's a frontispiece of Hobbes's famous Leviathan of 1651, which famously doesn't have Leviathan, i.e. the state, just holding the sword to punish you, but it also has famously if you can see it from the distance, it also has the monarch Leviathan holding the bishop's crook as well. So it's absolutely crucial in Hobbes's argument that the state should also decide the fundamentals of religion. Now, it's not long before that principle is challenged. And I mean, again, this is very speedy history here. But a good example of this, and it's a good example, it's also one of my favorite examples, comes from the letter concerning toleration, written in 1689 by John Locke. And it's, I think, one of the most wonderful pieces of writing, because in that text, Locke says this. He says, the care of souls does not belong to the magistrate, i.e. that's to the state. The care of souls does not belong to the magistrate. He said, the care, therefore, of every man's soul belongs unto himself and is to be left unto himself. In other words, it's a fundamental shift, because this is a proclamation that it is no part of the function of the state to get you into heaven. The way you get into heaven is up to you and down to your faith and so on. So this is a really, I think, a very significant shift in the sort of the balance of power about who controls what we think. Notice a reference to the soul, because that keeps all the three writers I'm going to talk about at length. One of them is Benjamin Constant, Mill, and Tocqueville, all talk about the notion of the soul, that there's an attack upon our soul. So you'll see that as we go along. What followed on from, it's a complicated story, what follows on from the sort of ideas expressed by John Locke was, in the 18th century, a far more developed and extensive theory of toleration, which stretched beyond the idea of religious faith to include more generally speech, thought, expression, and so on. And to give you an example, I'm just going to reference Voltaire's Philosophical Dictionary, 1764. All I'm going to be talking about is written in France, incidentally, but never mind. So in the entry on toleration, he says, what is toleration? it is a prerogative of humanity. It is clear that every individual who persecutes a man, his brother, because he does not agree with him, is a monster. And this becomes a sort of almost sort of Enlightenment, 18th century Enlightenment sort of faith that toleration is something that should be welcomed, encouraged, and so on. And the argument advanced by someone like Jonathan Israel, and Jonathan Israel is a controversial historian of the Enlightenment, is probably the historian of the Enlightenment at the moment. His argument is that by the end of the 18th century, you can identify a theory of what he calls universal toleration, which is grounded on the insistence upon full freedom of thought, expression, and the press. So by the end of the 18th century, this is becoming, at least in elite conversation, this is becoming a sort of given, a belief in freedom of thought and expression and so on. And if you want a clear expression of this, we see it in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in 1789. This, I can't remember which clause this is, about 14, I think. The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. Any citizen may therefore speak, write, and publish freely, except what is tantamount to the abuse of liberty in cases determined by law. So they're clear, absolutely clear sort of statement of the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, very, very much an expression of sort of Enlightenment philosophy of the day. However, the fact of the matter is that the monitoring and repression of ideas and publications remained an everyday reality really right across Europe, being in terms of censorship, the banning of books and the banning of authors and all of these sorts of things. States did, despite this, the emergence of this support for toleration, states did take it upon themselves to censor ideas, control ideas and so on. Again, usually with the view that, first of all, freedom of speech was a dangerous thing, but also dangerous in the sense that it could sow civil dissension, rebellion, and so on. So the reality, despite these great proclamations, the reality was still one of repression, censorship, and so on. And things only really get worse with the French Revolution, because although the French Revolution proclaims this in 1789, I'm sure you all know, but by 1792, 1793, things are taking a turn for the worse, and Robespierre and his pals have come to power, introduced the Reign of Terror, and amongst the many obnoxious and odious things they did was introduce a law of suspects, which was passed on the 17th of September 1793, which basically criminalized the expression of any views contrary to the Republic and to the Revolution. And indeed, back this up by saying anyone found guilty of expressing or even being suspect, notice is the law of suspects, people who are suspected of counterfeiting views against the Revolution and the Republic could be put to death. So basically, if you were found guilty, you were put to death. And there was obviously rigid press control and all of these sorts of things. The situation, one could argue, possibly got better with the arrival to power of Napoleon Bonaparte, but possibly not much better, because one of the things that Napoleon did is almost immediately begin by a censorship of the press. Indeed, most newspapers were closed down. Many writers were either silenced or exiled or so on. And of course, something similar happened in Britain during this period, partly because of the fear of insurrection and so on and so forth, inspired by the French example and so on. And in the French case, all of this was made worse by the promulgation of a sort of personality cult of Napoleon, the sort of worship of Napoleon, and so on. So, we've had this sort of great movement of enlightenment. There's a new book come out by Richard Watmore, incidentally, which traces the great disillusionment of Enlightenment thinkers. They're very optimistic. The revolution comes, revolution's marvelous, and lo and behold, it's not so marvelous, and Napoleon Bonaparte's not good either. So it's worth looking at that. But this experience of the French Revolution and of Napoleon Bonaparte sets people thinking about something they start to think of as a new form of dictatorship, a new form of despotism. They recognise there's something new about this. I mean, Robespierre himself says this. Robespierre himself says about his government, his revolutionary government, he said, you will not find anything about this in the book, in Plato, Aristotle, etc. This is new. This is something we've invented. And people took that seriously. And then Napoleon Bonaparte comes along, yeah, there's something new about this too. Now, so just dropping back a bit. So what's new? If you go back a little bit to Montesquieu, The Spirit of the Law, 1748, one of the great texts of the period, the key idea for Montesquieu was that despotism was taken to be ruled by fear. He has this typology of governments, one of which is despotism. The Spirit of the Laws is basically an attack on despotism. It's ruled by fear. Now, there's lots of things he says about this, but essentially, rule by fear is fear through violence, through arbitrary acts of oppression, designed essentially to reduce you to passive silence, to effectively, he said, to produce, he says, a beaten down people. That he takes to be the ambition of the despot. Now, people like, and the person I'm next going to speak about is someone called Benjamin Constant, start to think that there's something different about what Montesquieu is describing. Because what they notice, and I'm probably, forgive me if I say many of you might never have heard of Benjamin Constant. If you have, it's probably because he wrote a famous novel called Adolf. He's a great political theorist. I recommend it to you strongly. There's a lovely volume in Cambridge University Press, came out 20, 30 years ago. An absolute genius, in my opinion. And Constant started to think there's something new and different about this. And what is new and different about this? One of the things he noticed was whereas previous regimes were content to make you silent and passive, think about these new regimes. That wasn't good enough. You had to voice support. You couldn't sit there passively at home, not causing any trouble. That wasn't good enough for the new regime. These new regimes demanded that you were out there expressing your support, expressing your approval. Now, forgive me for saying so, this is a major insight, it strikes me, about what happens in the next 2 centuries about the nature of modern dictatorships. Think of Stalin, Mao Zedong, etc. The people have to go out and approve. And this is what he noticed, that this, in fact, was going on. The people were condemned to voice their approval. And this is the point. So it wasn't enough that they should just simply live, to go about their business, not causing any trouble. No, this new regime, this new type of dictatorship went into the intimate sanctuary of the individual's thoughts, forcing, as he said, the citizen to lie to his conscience. So it didn't want to control just your body, it wanted to control your very essence. And you had to prove that you supported the regime. And that seems to me as that's a fundamental insight into the nature of what these new regimes, which Tocqueville and Mill are going to be concerned about. Before we just move on to this, that leads Tocqueville to two very important conclusions. Three, sorry. One, it was a Protestant, incidentally. One, the idea of the individual conscience. The idea of the individual conscience, as he puts it, the last consolation of the oppressed. There's this bit of you. There's this bit, it's almost this sacred bit. It's back to the soul again. There's this bit of you, which is actually with the very essence of your freedom. And that's the thing that's got to be protected. And that's what these regimes want to take away. That, therefore, leads him to state a conclusion, which is exactly the conclusion which John Stuart Mill is going to state later on. Namely, that there is a part of human existence that quite properly should remain independent and beyond political control. Absolutely. And the third thing, and again you find this in Tocqueville and you find this in Mill, is expressed by Constant, as he put it, variety is life, university Uniformity, sorry, university is death, actually. Variety is life, uniformity is death. And he has this image. Of the emergence of modern society where he says we're like individual atoms on a vast leveled plane. But above us there is a power which controls us. It's a fabulous description, I think, of modernity. So the idea was, what you see in all of this, the idea was that, okay, we're used to the traditional idea that states oppress us, but there's something else. There's a new form of state. There's a new form of oppression, and that is increasingly identified as public opinion. Again, public opinion, a concept which emerges in the 18th century. We tend to think all these concepts have been around forever. They haven't. Public opinion emerges as a concept in the 18th century. And these writers start to realize that this thing, public opinion, is a power which is, in a sense, additional to the state, and actually, in a sense, not controlled by the state, but which in actual fact can indeed control the state. So it's the other way around. So there's this new power emerging. So the state doesn't control, but it in turn will actually control the state. So they start to see the emergence of this new form, this new possible form of oppression. Now, that's some of the context then for the two writers I'm now going to discuss the next quarter an hour, 20 minutes. It's in that context that Alexis de Tocqueville goes to America in 1831, 1832, travels around America, etc. My book is partly about that, but it's also, as Toby suggested, about the other travels. And he comes back, and in 1835 and then 1840, he writes 2 volumes called Democracy in America. And they're immediately perceived as to be classics. The Americans immediately say, these are the best books ever written about America. But actually, the one thing they don't like is when Tocqueville starts talking about the tyranny of the majority, but that's another story. His account is broadly positive, and it's absolutely fascinating today. Tocqueville's scholarship is completely dominated by Americans, for whom Tocqueville is a patron saint, because he's so positive about America. They completely dominate scholarship on top of it, apart from lone individuals like myself. It's a broadly positive account of the United States. He thinks there's lots to admire. But he does see the dark side, and it's the dark side that comes increasingly to preoccupy him. I did another book, an earlier book on Tocqueville called Tocqueville on America after 1840, in which the dark side becomes very, very pessimistic about America. Again, something Americans on the whole don't touch at all. So what's the picture that he presents? Well, democracy. But you think, well, democracy is a political form. No, he didn't mean it as a political form. For him, democracy was what he called the equality of social conditions. That's to say, what the thing he spotted about America straight away was it was non-hierarchical, it was a non-aristocratic society, where, broadly speaking, everyone was the same. That's the thing about it. Everyone was the same. Remember, this is a French aristocrat. He arrives and thinks, where do I fit into this place? He realizes, I don't. There's no place for people like me in this society, because it's a democratic society. And he takes the view that this form of the equality of social conditions comes, in fact, to impregnate all dimensions of American life, the relationship of parents to their children, relationships between husband and wife, servants and whatever, etc. All aspects of American life, in a sense, can be explained by this equality of social conditions. Now, what are the downsides? The downsides, basically, as I put there, well, one of them is materialism. He thinks the Americans, it's true and still true, that basically live to make money, brackets, therefore they neglect cultural life. He talks about democratic individualism. By what he means there is not selfishness. Incidentally, the word individualism is essentially coined by Tocqueville. It comes into the English language because of Tocqueville. What he means by that is this closing down, this sort of turning inwards, not looking towards society, but looking into your sort of immediate surroundings and so on. So the privatization of life, in other words. From the privatization of life follows something else he identifies, which is called which he identifies as centralization. That is to say, because individuals turn away from public participation, they increasingly therefore rely upon the state to do things which they might have done otherwise. I'm not going to do this. Someone's got to do it. Well, the state might as well do it. This comes especially in the volume of 1840. He actually says, this is a new form of despotism. He said, it's so new, he said, I can't give a word for it, so I'll just describe it. He says, like 20 pages describing this thing, which you and I would recognise as a welfare state, basically. Where, as he puts it, in this idealised view, government will be the shepherd and we will be the sheep. But the point is, we'll be sheep. And it's not an enviable position to be sheep. But the fourth thing is the tyranny of majority. So this is the thing the Americans didn't like at all. They denied that this was the case. And this was a tyranny over thought and therefore over our behaviour. He said it's the very essence of democratic governments that the empire of the majority is absolute. He goes on, the majority of the United States therefore has an immense power in fact and a power in opinion almost as great. I just want to dwell on that. An immense power in fact, by that he means the control of government, but a power in opinion almost as great. So that's the other thing. So this identification. Traditionally, it's just the state that oppresses, but now this is something else out there, this power of opinion that can oppress, which is controlled by the majority. So in other words, in democracy, he says, the majority control not only have political control, but they also have authority over opinion and thought. And Tocqueville is absolutely clear about the consequences of this for the individual. He says, when a party or an individual suffers from an injustice in the United States, to whom do you want him to address? Public opinion, ? This is what forms the majority, he says. Therefore, however iniquitous or unreasonable is a measure that strikes you, you must submit to it. So because this is so all-encompassing, this power, this power of a public opinion controlled by the majority, you've got nowhere to go. There's no hiding place for you. Nor does Tocqueville mince words about the power of this control that's being exerted. He says, this is a form of control. The tyranny of the majority he actually says this, is a form of control more effective than even the Spanish Inquisition. He says, all the Spanish Inquisition was able to do was ban you from writing books. The tyranny of the majority is so powerful, it stops you wanting to write them in the first place. It's so dead into your mind that even the will to write these books is taken away. He says there's no freedom of mind in America. Slight exaggeration. There's no freedom of mind in America, he says. In short, he says the tyranny of the majority, tyranny of public opinion, destroys intellectual independence. Quote, notice souls again. It penetrates souls by a sort of immense pressure of the minds of all on the intellect of each. Again, that sort of idea. Now, clearly there's a lot more we could say about this, and remember it's a big book, 700-800 pages, so there is a lot more one could say about it. But I hope you've got the general idea now that what he's identifying is a new form of power, a new form of control, which people haven't identified before, which is the power of opinion voiced through the majority. And I'm sure you've got lots of questions to ask about that, because we tend to think it's exercised by a minority now, but that's another story. But anyway, and in the book, obviously, he tells us something about how he thinks this power, this tyranny of the majority, can be alleviated and so on. But in a sense, I haven't got time to go into that. But the thing is, he's identified something new. Formerly, tyranny employed chains and executions as its crude weapons. Now it leaves the body alone and goes straight to the spirit, in other words, goes straight to the mind. That's what it wants to control. It doesn't want to control your actions. It knows if it controls what you think, it doesn't need to control your actions. That's the point that he wants to make. Now, all of this was known to John Stuart Mill very early on. Tocqueville came to London in 1833, and amongst the many distinguished people he met was John Stuart Mill. And they became very good friends. They remained friends. There's a little hiccup in the 1840s. They remained friends right until Tocqueville dies. One of the last things, shortly before Tocqueville's death, 1859, John Stuart Mill actually sends him a copy of On Liberty, signed, which sadly Tocqueville never lived to read. So from the very beginning, Mill was familiar with this, and he reviews Democracy in America in the Edinburgh Review, both the first volume and the second volume in 1835 and 1840. And he says there, in one of those reviews, he says, the tyranny which we fear, i.e. Mill, the tyranny which we fear and which Monsieur de Tocqueville principally dreads is a tyranny not over the body, but over the mind. So he picks up on this idea from Mill, from Tocqueville straight away, and it's that idea that's going to inform, it's not the only idea that informs it, but that idea is going to be one of the fundamental ideas which informs the whole argument on liberty, which he publishes in 1859. Now, if you know anything about John Stuart Mill, you will know that John Stuart Mill was a thinking machine. He was brought up to be, he was an experiment. He was an educational experiment. Bentham, the monstrous Jeremy Bentham, and his father, and Mill's father, James Mill, actually set out to make him a sort of calculating, utilitarian calculating machine. And what they produced was, it has to be said, something of a monster. But it was a monster which throughout his life churned out enormous numbers of ideas and so on. So what we're going to do, we're just going to look at On Liberty. This is me being the academic here. I'm qualifying this. There's a hell of a lot more in John Stuart Mill than what I'm going to tell you. Next, Mill's ideas have always been controversial. At the time, James Fitzjames Stephen publishes a famous book attacking Mill's On Liberty. And Mill's On Liberty has remained a subject of controversy. Most recently, those of you read Unheard might have seen the article by my friend Patrick Deneen called J.S. Mill and the Despotism of Progress. You might have seen that. It came out in early May, end of May, I can't remember. If you've not read it, go back. There's a whole edition, I think, of Unheard on Mill. And so on. Go away and read that. Deneen's argument being that Mill's project is, quote, secure in the first instance the political dominance of the progressive element of society. Old academics like me didn't need to be told that. We could simply go back to Maurice Cowling's classic book of 1963 called Mill and Liberalism, a book which was met with outrage and dismay by the academic establishment at the time, but which I strongly recommend to you, as indeed I strongly recommend anything by the late Maurice Cowling. There's much truth in these criticisms, but in the present context, I'm going to put them aside because I want to briefly talk about, essentially, is, in a sense, what Mill might provide of use. The starting point is what Mill identifies as, again, as this new threat to liberty. It's on page, this is a lovely little edition, if you can, the Penguin edition. Like other tyrannies, the tyranny of the majority was at first and still vulgarly held in dread, chiefly as operating through the acts of the public authorities. But reflecting persons perceive that when society is itself the tyrant, its means of tyrannizing are not restricted to acts which it may do by the hands of the political functionaries. In other words, it's a practice, what he calls of social tyranny. So it's again this idea, it's not just the state which threatens us with oppression. It's this new form of social tyranny, namely ideas, or the threat or the power of the majority. So I'm sure those of you who know this book will know all about this. So what does he want to say? Well, he wants to say there is a limit to the legitimate interference of collective opinion with individual independence, and to find that limit and to maintain it against an encroachment is as indispensable to the good condition of human affairs as protection against political despotism. Again, that's division. There's political despotism, and this is other form of despotism, which is the despotism over opinion. The context there, he says, is the likings and dislikings of society, or of some powerful portion of it, are thus the main thing which is practically determines the rules laid down for general observance. Now notice, of some powerful portion of it. In other words, it's not necessarily the majority as such that he's worried about. It's the people who presume to speak in their name. It's the people who control the institutions which in a sense generate ideas, which is what he's worried about. So Mill seeks to set out what he terms one very simple principle. It is not a very simple principle, but he says it's a very simple principle to determine the limits of society, the limits of society's control over the individual. And this is the famous thing. This is the harm. You've all probably heard of the harm principle. Mill doesn't call it the harm principle, but political philosophers ever since have described it as the harm principle. The principle is that the sole end which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering with the liberty of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightly exercised over any member of a civilized society against his will is to prevent harm to others. So he's basically saying, listen, we've got a major problem here. We've got this new power which it's threatening us with very significant levels of control. And what we've got to come up with is some sort of principle which will determine, what the proper limits of its power are. And this, in a sense, is, his answer, unless something can be said to cause harm to someone else. Massively controversial. Unless something can be said to cause harm to someone else, it should not be restricted, it should not be restrained, and so on. And this then gives him this. Therefore, the invocation of the harm principle is over himself, over his own body and mind. The individual is sovereign. That's his conclusion. Unless you're causing harm to someone, you can do, in a sense, what you want. But he recognizes we live under the eye of a hostile and dreaded censorship. So this is why he has to, he thinks it's really important, we'll come to it in a second, he thinks it's really important that this principle has to be established. Now, a couple of things by way of explanation here. First of all, Mill does not rely upon the language of rights to defend his case. He doesn't say we have a right to free speech. His defense of free speech, free expression, etc., is done purely in utilitarian terms. Remember, he was taught by Bentham, taught by his father, James Mill, the two great utilitarians of the 19th century. No, his defense of individual liberty takes the form of essentially saying individual liberty is good for individuals, it makes you a better individual, and therefore, if it makes us all better as individuals, it will make for a better society. Corollary, if we're not good individuals, etc., etc., etc. Secondly, he recognizes that the principle is far more easily applied to questions of physical action than it is to questions of thought and discussion. Obviously, manifestly clear that if it should be the case, I should be prohibited from hitting this young gentleman, in the face. Manifest physical oppression, clearly that should be stopped. It's more difficult when it comes to ideas, because ideas are, in a sense, more nebulous, and so on. So he recognizes that thought and discussion is a more problematic case than actual physical action where you might be harming someone. Physical harm is quite easily identified. Intellectual harm is less so. Nevertheless, for all the fact he recognizes it's difficult, this is something he says we've absolutely got to solve. And why have we got to solve it? Because, bear in mind he's writing in the 1859, because at that time he's saying, because the threat to liberty of thought and opinion is ever growing. We're not living in a situation where this has become less of a threat, it's becoming more of a threat. Indeed, he says, of individuals, human beings, he says it's probably the case that they possess a natural disposition to want to impose their own ideas and inclinations on others. We rather like that. So it's easier for us and so on. So what we get from Mill, and give me a couple of minutes now, what we get from Mill is a spirited defense of liberty of thought as a vital ingredient for individual self-development and societal well-being. It tells us, for example, that all silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility. It is, he tells us, to assume the right, quote, to decide the question for others without allowing them to hear what can be said on the contrary side. He goes on, even the most seemingly erroneous ideas should be heard, for any opinion may be true. Moreover, he says, slightly lost now, no. Oh, here we are. We'll come on to this. Moreover, he says, let's go back a bit that's right. Moreover, he says, even if a received opinion is true, it is good for it to be challenged, to hear counter-arguments. If not, it'll just become dead thought and so on. It'll have no vibrancy and so on and so forth. Indeed, he tells us, in any exchange of opinions, it is rare for one view to be entirely right and the other to be entirely wrong. So it's a call then for constant debate, constant discussion, to keep ideas alive, to challenge ideas, to challenge the way we think about things. Crucially, for Mill, the fact that someone's views give offence to others could never be grounds for their repression. He says a distaste for the views of others cannot be deemed an injury. He says that the only grounds for silencing someone could be if their views, in a sense, were in danger of engendering illegal actions. For example, if I was to stand here now and say, right, you should all go out and murder X, for example, you would say, no, I should have no right to say that. But in all other cases, ideas should be left as they are. Where it quite definitely cannot, where this silencing cannot take place, he says, is in the name of what he says, where people call for our moral improvement. You must be prevented from reading such and such a thing because it will be morally damaging to you. You should only read morally improving things of which we approve. That, he says, is a non-starter. Nor, he says, is the desire, as he puts it, to make everyone conform to an approved standard. Grounds for silencing opinion and making you read things which you might otherwise not have read. Now, in the book, he's aware of all the challenges to this, and he addresses them and so on. In the final chapter in particular, he talks about applications. And I just want to give you an illustration of, in a sense, what he says, or examples of the sort of how he will seek to apply these ideas. One example is Sabbatarian legislation, in other words, laws on the Sabbath, and banning certain kinds of amusements and work on Sundays. I've got my dear friend Jeff Wilmore here. And Jeff and I will remember when we were first students in Swansea in 1970, getting a pint of beer on a Sunday night was very, very difficult, wasn't it, in Wales? You simply couldn't get a pint of beer. We had a way. Now, Mill admits, he says, that it might be a good idea to have a day when people are free from work. But he says that doesn't have to be a Sunday. It could be any day of the week to give people a day off for their refreshment and so on and so forth. But he says imposing restrictions on our amusements and so on and so forth on a Sunday on the grounds that this is a religious obligation, or on the grounds that it might offend someone to see other people enjoying themselves drinking a glass of beer, is not grounds enough, or in fact it's nowhere near grounds enough for stopping people engaging in this sort of behaviour. He says this is a motive of legislation that can never be too earnestly protested against. Another case he gives is the case of a predominantly Muslim community prohibiting the eating of pork. Again, Mill does not deny that Muslims would find this practice revolting and that they will believe it to be forbidden by God. But he effectively says, so what? In no way can it be said that the eating of pork can harm the majority Muslim population. He adds, with the personal tastes and self-regarding concerns of individuals, the public has no right to interfere. And that leads us, in a sense, to his call for action. And there's a mistake in here, actually. If the claims of individuality are ever to be asserted, the time is now. While much is still wanting to complete it should be enforced assimilation. My apologies. If resistance waits till life is reduced nearly to one unified type, all deviations from that type will come to be considered impious, immoral, even monstrous, and contrary to nature. mankind speedily become unable to conceive diversity when they have been for some time unaccustomed to see it. In brief, what you have in these two thinkers, and I've been as brief as I possibly could, my apologies for going on for about 40 minutes, but what you have in these two speakers is these two thinkers is an awareness of this new form of control that is emerging, which is essentially the power over opinions, the power to control your thoughts. And this, they see, is in some ways even more dangerous than the desire of states to control your bodily movements. This is controlling your thoughts. And if you control people's thoughts, then you control all of the rest. And both of them underpin that view with the firm belief that a life without liberty is not worth living, and that in that conception of liberty, free speech must be understood as a core component. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Very stimulating lecture, Jeremy. I'm going to ask you one question, and then we'll throw it out to the audience and the folks at home.
Okay.
So my question is, which I think is a question you addressed in your book, if I recall, were Tocqueville and Mill over-anxious about democracy and about the encroachments of majority opinion on individual intellectual freedom? They seem to have this kind of, they saw democracy as the incoming tide, and they were concerned that it would have this oppressive, despotic impact. There would be nothing to hold it back and protect individual intellectual freedom. But it hasn't really happened. The main threats to intellectual freedom today is not democracy. It's not, demagogues. It's not really populism. It's various authoritarian, technocratic elites. Isn't it? I mean, the problem isn't the tyranny of the majority. The problem we face is the tyranny of a minority, as you alluded to. So were they being a bit hysterical and alarmist about a threat which hasn't really materialised, at least not in... it may have done, but it doesn't seem to be with us anymore.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously that's. I mean, I mentioned that because you can see that coming. We don't. The argument would be we do not have a tyranny of the majority. We have a tyranny of the minority. In the Tocqueville, obviously it's a big book, and in the book he actually sets out the things Tocqueville's view is democracy is inevitable. Okay, I mean it's the first of the great books which says America's the future. I mean, people in France just thought, well, Britain's the future. No, it's America's the future. So democracy is the future, and in a way, the tale of the book is to say, well, listen, guys, it's going to come. So you've got to think about this now, and you've got to think about how you're going to manage this, because you won't be able to stop it. So think of ways of working with it. And in America itself, he sets out the things which he thinks about America, which do. Which will prevent this form of repression being as serious as might be. So, for example, the federal system, judicial review, all of these sorts of things. He also thinks big role for religion, life, associational life in America, all of those sorts of things. So he does think that this is something which can be managed and controlled. And this incidentally is an argument which, need to say, American writers come up and say, well, he doesn't really think this is a reality. It's a sort of fear that he's got. Well, actually, if you look at Tocqueville's writings, he gives various examples of what he thinks are tyrannies of opinion. For example, he points out that if you go to states where slavery had existed, where it no longer exists, still black people are treated as inferior. They cannot go to the schools with white people. They're not buried in the same sandwiches as white people, and so on. And when you've got that and I think it's a classic case for America, when you've got a sort of white majority which persistently regards black people as inferior, then you are going to have a serious problem. Mill spends most of his life actually grappling with this idea and trying to come again with mechanisms to. This is the other side of Mill, which people like Pat Deneen don't like, because what Mill basically. In his writings on representative government, for example, he has proportional representation. And his idea of proportional representation is what you should do is seek to ensure that the most enlightened people are in power. So he seeks to come up with a series of mechanisms which will keep, in a sense, this ignorant majority opinion at bay. So as I say, I've just given you the dark side for both of them. Both of them had proposals as to how the dangers of democracy might be alleviated. I don't know. I mean, I do think that's why the point I made, the quotation I gave from Mill, which says it's actually not necessarily the numerical majority we're concerned about. It's actually the people controlling institutions. Now, that might be what the sort of thing which we're concerned about now. So it's not necessarily just the masses out there, because on the whole they're pretty much excluded from all of this. But it's the people who've gained control of institutions, and in a sense who presume to speak on the behalf of society and so on, are the people that we should really worry about. So they might well have over-exaggerated, but I still think they were onto something, in the sense that they identified something new. Because traditionally it's always in political philosophy, political theory, always tends to focus on the power of the state to control individuals. And so it's not just the state. There's something out there as well. And I think my view would be what's happening at the moment. It's not necessarily the state, although we clearly have a state which is not, on the whole, prepared to do much about it. It's it's a whole series of charitable organisations and so on, which are assuming powers which we probably wouldn't want them to have. Which are now, putting on courses here, there, and everywhere, and institutions like universities, which enforce us to have diversity, inclusion, training, and all of these sorts of things. And that's the form it's taking now, and I think that's something they would have recognised. Tocqueville certainly would have recognised that sort of thing. So it's not the state telling us to do this; it's the stuff out there, this sort of nebulous world of organisations who now, have got. Who Mill instead would just regard as religious bigots. I mean, religion is a big thing that Mill has really got. That's what he's really going for. That's why a lot of conservatives don't like it. But it's religion institutions he's going for. But think of all the institutions now which have been taken on board this stuff, and which they're not institutions of the state, they're charities or whatever, but they're still pumping the stuff out and they're controlling stuff. In the name of, I don't know what, they probably wouldn't say the majority, but in the name of society or something like that. So they might have exaggerated, but I still think there's still telling us something to really be aware of, to be careful about. It's not just the state doing this, and that's the traditional obsession of political theorists. It's the power of the state. No, there's something else out there which controls us.
Okay. Shall we take, say, 3 questions?
Hi, thank you very much for the speech. It was fantastic. I'm sure you can tell by my accent that I am American. I definitely grew up learning about Tocqueville and Lafayette and how there was a love affair between the Americans and French. That is not in existence now, but was for a long time. I'm curious, because I've not heard about his questioning of the tyranny of the majority. I'm curious if, in your opinion, if a counter was put to that to say, how does that reconcile with the fact that the U.S. has explicit laws for freedom of speech, for separation of state and religion, such that the most powerful in the world, I would also argue, because obviously part of my upbringing, but also his life, is I do agree that the future was what America had, which I would argue was not a democracy. I would argue it was a constitutional republic, which sets out very explicitly what can and cannot be done, limiting government. So that's obviously changed quite a lot now, but I'm curious how you reconcile, or how you think you would reconcile what you observed versus what is actually written in the Constitution, what the laws are.
Should we take two more questions before you start answering them?
You've got to be very specific about what you mean by harm, and it can't just be being upset. It's got to be something, as you indicate, something very physical. But have Tocqueville's and Mill's ideas ever been used to try to justify the precise opposite of what they should aim at?
Hello, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. If I remember well, Mill, at some point on Liberty, he says that he gives some examples when the state can intervene in private life, let's say. And he gives an example of education, isn't it? So he says that, if you have a family that they don't want to educate their children and so on, so the state has like a duty to educate children. So, I wonder, actually it's what you said, that Mill thinks that we should place the right people in the institutions, isn't it? So I wonder what would you suggest, or what your thoughts are of how do we get, in the end, to place the right people in the institutions that govern us. So even this has to be the education system or other social systems, but not in a way of, okay, who should we vote, but how do we ensure that people from a young age, we will cultivate the right traits, characters to get there. Thank you.
Well, the first one was essentially between, I guess the legal structure of the Constitution of the United States, etc., and the reality. That's a very good point, because one of the really important points that Tocqueville wants to make is, well, there is what the Constitution says, and there's what actually happens on the ground. And what happens on the ground across America is often very, very different from what actually happens, what the Constitution declares. So, he doesn't give many examples, incidentally. I should say that he very much sees this as an actual threat. The tyranny of the majority is an actual threat, but very much as a future threat. Okay, so it's something he sees there. He sees a potential for it. Now, he sees America's got lots of other things which can work against this. But it's still a threat. And so take the example of freedom of speech. So he gives an example of, he doesn't give many examples, but one example he gives is the 1812 war. A newspaper in, let's say Mississippi, argues against the war. And the reality is, the people simply ransack the newspaper, close it down. So the law can say we've got freedom of speech in this country. The reality of the way the people behave is if they don't like something, they're simply going to close it down. So he gives those sorts of examples. And a quotation I didn't give, which is where he says something to the effect that, listen, while ever the majority disagree, there'll be debate. Fine, there'll be debate. But as soon as the majority have made up their mind, all debate stops. That's what he wants to see things happen with America. And he sees this sort of consensus of opinion. So the Constitution might say we've got free speech. The reality is consensus. So there's for him, there is a disparity between what the Constitution says about free speech, etc., and the actual reality. And I do come back to the case, which people tend not to dwell upon, but what he says about the position of black Americans. And no matter what the Constitution says, black Americans are simply an oppressed group. And that's how white Americans are going to treat them. They're not going to have the right to vote. They're not going to have the right to this. It simply won't happen because white public opinion does not consider that to be legitimate. So that's the sort of argument he gives. Now, whether he's right or not, you're a better place to judge than me. But he sees a disparity between those two.
Let me rephrase the second question, Jeremy, which is often attempts to silence people with whom you disagree
Yes.
are dressed up as an appeal to the harm principle. And the example, the one I discussed earlier with Sean Corby, you can't say these things I find disagreeable, because having to hear them is causing me and others me and other vulnerable people psychological harm. So one thing I'm curious about is, why do people who are essentially authoritarian religious fundamentalists conceal themselves behind this kind of rhetoric of liberalism in order to try and force others into silence? And did Mill anticipate that difficulty, that the harm principle might at some point be invoked to actually silence free speech rather than support it?
To begin at the end, I don't think he did. And it's interesting that Mill writes a book, and it's subsequently that this becomes identifiable or identified as a harm principle. And since when? Countless books, articles, and so on have been written about the harm principle. Now, I think you've got something coming up in Scotland shortly, which is about hate speech and so on, which hinges on this issue. That is to say, an enormous amount actually hinges on this issue of harm. And if you read the specialist literature in political theory, you'll see that big debate about this, because people realize that if they can swing it, that people will conclude, unlike Mill, that the expression of an idea you're offended by is a form of harm. If they can win that argument and make it acceptable to people, that's a game changer. But let's be clear, Mill did not believe that. He was absolutely explicit about that. That is not injury. Injury is me hitting this chap in the face. That's a palpable injury. Me saying something you disagree with is absolutely clear, does not constitute injury. It does not constitute harm. And that's absolutely fundamental for him. But clearly, if I understand you correctly, there are people who want to take that harm principle and say this is causing harm and therefore it should be stopped. Yeah. But therefore, how we define harm becomes central to all of this. And being offended is not harm.
Yes,
as far as I'm concerned.
And what's so odd about this invocation, this perversion of the harm principle, and incidentally, another victory the Free Speech Union recently achieved, was to get the harmful communications offence stripped out of the online safety bill, whereby it was going to introduce a new offence into criminal law in England and Wales, whereby if you said something that caused someone else serious distress, you could be imprisoned. You met various other conditions. You could be imprisoned for up to 2 years. And it was called the harmful communications offence. But what's curious about this invocation of the harm principle to encompass psychological harm as a way of trying to silence opinions you find disagreeable is that the people invoking it clearly don't believe it. I don't think the people trying to shut up Sean Corby actually thought that hearing him quote Martin Luther King would cause them psychological harm. I mean, it seems sort of almost infantilely, obviously, just a rhetorical manoeuvre. But why don't people just say, I think what you're saying is wrong, and I think it's immoral, and it's going to corrupt those who might hear it. But instead of prosecuting that kind of religious argument, they say, it's going to cause people psychological harm. Why are they relying on that? Why are they dressing up their authoritarianism in these liberal clothes?
Because, Mill is all for you and I having a frank discussion about why we disagree and why I think your views might be immoral and so on and so forth, and how I'm perfectly at liberty to try and encourage you to behave differently. That's fine. But once you invoke the harm, once you say it's harm, it's a different story. Harm closes it down. Harm says, no discussion, this is harm, end of story. No, he's all in favour of those sort of things. I think this is wrong and whatever. Fine, we'll have a discussion about it. That's the nature of debate. But once you invoke harm, you close it down.
It's incredible that it closes it down, given it's so obviously just a rhetorical manoeuvre. But let's go to the third question. Did Mill have a program in mind, like Plato, to train the ruling class to make sure they were educated properly and would act in a virtuous, public interested way?
Well, that's a very interesting question with regard to Mill in particular. And if you go back to Maurice Cowling's great book, I mean, Cowling thinks Mill had an idea for this. He took the idea of a clerisy from Coleridge, this idea of an intellectual elite, and what Mill really wants to see is power in the hands of an intellectual elite. And there's no doubt, and that's the proportional representation argument is partly about that. So he wants a certain group of people in power. He's very, very concerned about what he calls the commercial spirit, the people, as was Tocqueville, people who just want to make money, they think life's just about money. He's very concerned about those people having power. He's concerned about the ignorant people having power, and so on. This is the bit which, on the whole, doesn't wear well with John Stuart Mill because it is overtly elitist. My overall view of both writers, if you want to put them in a positive light, is, and indeed of the great Benjamin Constant, who I recommend to you all again, is that what they're saying is you've got to look actually at power itself. Rather than think about who's controlling that power, look at the nature of power itself. And it doesn't really matter who controls that power. The chances are it's going to be abused. Therefore, what you should be seeking to do, I mean, this was the thing that, Constant says about, the French Revolution. So before, sovereignty resided in the king, and then it resided in the people, but it was still the same sovereignty. It still had the same power. It could still be abused. It could still terrify people, etc. So what we should think about doing is looking at the nature of power and thinking about, rather than saying who should have that power, thinking about, well, they're all great decentralizers, federalists and so on. Let's decentralize power. Let's split power up as much as we can so that no group of people, doesn't matter who they are, so that no group of people will have that level of power, because the chances are, both of these writers are deeply suspicious of the capacity of government to get things right. Mill says, the chances are, and we think it's demonstrated virtually daily in this country, the chances are that governments will make a mess of things. And they'll make a mess of things, but it'll cost an enormous amount of money, etc., etc., etc. So rather think about attacking the notion of power itself, rather than thinking who are the best people equipped to control that, because they're all, on the whole, going to make a mess of it. So I think that's the force of both of them. But there is this argument in Mill about a clerisy, an intellectual elite, which I have grave doubts about myself, but there we are.
Are there any questions from people watching at home, Jan?
Yes. So here's one. Wasn't de Tocqueville wrong to see democracy as hostile to minority opinion? Democracy is premised on free speech and the right to freely voice and contest ideas. Democracy requires majority opinion to have sway, but that's irrelevant to free speech.
Well, that's not what Tocqueville believed. That we would like to think it was that way. But what Tocqueville was concerned about was precisely that in this situation, the power of the majority would be such that the minority would not be heard, and they would indeed be silenced. So that was the fear that he had. Whether he was right or wrong about that is another question. But certainly, he saw that the majority could be. It was a very, very brave thing to argue. You think we're on the dawn of democracy, and immediately someone says, "Hang on a minute, guys, this might be problematic. This is the first sort of democracy in the world, in the modern world. This might be problematic. This democracy could actually start to oppress people." That, in a sense, is part of the originality of what he's saying, because everyone's like, "Fine, you've had a tyranny of the minority, aristocrats, and so on. Actually, give the power to the people. Oh, that's bound to be good." Actually, it might not be.
That's a question I had actually from reading both of the texts that you were recommending, which I suggest people go back and read if you haven't read prior to tonight's lecture, which is this idea of that the rule of the majority is not just a kind of technical solution to decision making. It's got a moral weight to it, and that does seem to be what de Tocqueville is disputing. And so that idea, which I know I would buy into, that kind of quite romantic idea that we transcend the individual through collective decision-making, through democracy, and that all the kind of the movements, social movements that have pushed for the vote, for all the groups that were excluded when de Tocqueville was talking about it, there's got a kind of moral power to the call for democracy. So is he right or wrong, do you think, to dispute that?
Well, I mean, you're right. He sees that it has this moral power, and that's part of the thing that he so worries about, because, almost like, so what? It doesn't mean it can't be wrong. And just to say, well, I've got to obey this because the majority says it, and the majority is good. No, it simply doesn't follow. But he can see there's this. If you can speak on behalf of the majority, that's a good thing. You might think it is, but he finds that deeply worrying. He's wrong about lots of things, incidentally, in the book, as indeed is Mill. But one of the things that Tocqueville, this was a standard trope, incidentally, amongst the French who visited America, was there was no culture in America. There were no great writers in America. Well, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, these people didn't exist as far as they were concerned. But they've got this idea that it's this sort of amorphous mass out there. That description, see, they take this description from Constant's idea that we're individual atoms on a vast level plane. That's what modernity is. There are no sort of, bumps here and there and so on. We're all laid out there, all the same, all thinking the same, and therefore all potentially subject to control by any power that manages to emerge above us, because we've got no defense against this. And if that power can claim that it speaks in the name of the majority, then God help the rest, because you've got nowhere. That's his point. You've got nowhere to turn. That quotation I gave. Sorry, wherever you turn, there's a majority. Majority controls the government, the majority controls public opinion, majority controls the press. You've got nowhere to go. So you're stuck. And you best keep quiet. And if you don't keep quiet, you'll be in trouble. So I think that's one of his lessons. Just because it's the majority doesn't mean to say it's right. And it has no moral superiority over, ultimately, for the three writers, I should have talked about Constant, Tocqueville and Mill, the individual. Because that's what they come down to in the end. They come down to the individual and the soul of the individual, the conscience of the individual. That is where freedom resides, as far as they're concerned. And the majority is as much a threat as the minority, as the government, and so on, to that idea.
Yeah, so I think why Mill and Tocqueville's warnings about the tyranny of majority still make sense, even though what's emerging today is a kind of authoritarian technocracy in which the majority view is sidelined. But nonetheless, one of the ways in which experts exercise their power is by claiming that there is a majority view amongst this class of experts. So we see that in the case of trying to shut down any dissent from net zero. It is settled science amongst climate scientists that unless we reach net zero by 2050, the world will start to boil. So the majority principle is invoked as a source of authority, unimpeachable authority, but only within these tiny, educated, elite bubbles. It's sort of a paradox, but nonetheless, the majority principle has been retained as a source of moral legitimacy by the elites who ignore the majority. couple more questions before we go home. Yes, gentleman at the back. Just wait for the mic.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your talk as well. You'd spoke a lot about Tocqueville's democracy in America. I was wondering if we had anything to learn from his other great work, L'Ancien Régime, that I studied at university, where, of course, America, when he was visiting it, was mostly a free society, whereas he wrote about France. And actually the problem there for liberty is that the philosophes, the people who sort of write about liberty, these ideas are completely detached from ordinary people, and that actually when the revolution comes, most people in France are more interested in equality than liberty. So I was just wondering, I know he says a lot in that book, but if there's anything we can learn from that book that connects to what Tocqueville said in Democracy in America.
We used to do the Oxford bench. I will. Yes, I thought you might have been.
Before you answer that, Jeremy, let's just get one question. We're just going to ask the last question. Gentleman down here in front.
Thank you again very much for your lecture. I really appreciated it. Both of the men who you expounded to us defended free speech flowing from the conscience and the soul, which you mentioned. Now, I think the reason people today say that views they don't like are actually harmful to them is because they've adopted a view of the soul or the inner person, which is a sort of a psychologized Freudian view of the self. So my question is, can you defend free speech today without somehow recovering a view of the soul or the conscience from those men?
Very, very good question. The first one, so forgive me for identifying you as an Oxford student who would have read Tocqueville's Ancien Régime in your first year in your Gobbets bit, and it marks people for life. One of the reviews of my book actually began by saying, I read Tocqueville as an undergraduate and I never wanted to read him again. However, this book convinces me that Tocqueville has something to say. So Tocqueville wrote a second great book in 1856. It was meant to be in 2 volumes, but he died beforehand. It's called The Ancien Régime and the Revolution. It's a very, very different book, and his preoccupation there, as you say, is he looks at the French Revolution again. He has this idea that really what inspired it was a love of liberty, yes, but the love of equality was greater, and that's, in a sense, that's the bit of that book. It's this idea: be very wary of placing equality before liberty, because it's a life of liberty which counts rather than a life of equality. It is a great book. And going back to my thing about American academics, on the whole, it never figures in their accounts of Tocqueville because it doesn't say much about America at all. Though I show in my book that he does say quite a bit about America. So it is a great book, but it's very, very different. And of course, it's written 20 odd years later with a whole. The problem he's addressing really in that book is how to explain Napoleon III. That's how was it that democracy in 1848 in the Second French Republic, when people are given the vote, they vote for Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, and how they produce a second empire. And that is to say, how is it that the French gave up freedom? That's the question he's dealing with. So, which is a great question. It's a fabulous question, and it's as pertinent as any other question that he asked. Second question is really interesting. Yours is really interesting too, but in a sense, and I don't really have an answer to that, because you're quite right, because in a post-Freudian world, we think about what they were talking about as a consciousness soul as a very, very different entity. As I mentioned, Constant was a Protestant and so on, so you'd have had that, that whole Protestant tradition about the importance of the individual conscience and so on and so forth. But for all three, I think with Mill, it's a figure of speech, because he was not at all religious. For the other two, I think they actually meant it. They thought there was something in us. There was something about being a human being. You possessed something, and they called it the soul. And that actually was the very heart, there was the very essence of you, and that essence was liberty. that was the life you want to lead, and that somehow there were these terrible forces outside which actually weren't content just to control your the exterior actions, but actually wanted to get right inside and control that. As you say, the Freudian conception of the conscious is completely different, and it couldn't possibly be used in the way that these three writers use that, because for them it's our essence. It's what they want to say. This is it. This is the thing that's most important about you, and these people are trying to get to it and destroy it, and just almost like it's the Orwellian world. I mean, I think I go back to Constant. I think Constant's reflections. Remember, he's writing at the time. He's seen. I mean, he's been exiled by Napoleon Bonaparte and all these sorts of things, and he's seen this close up. And he realizes there's something really special about this. This is the Jacobins were bad, but Napoleon is something different about this. And that idea of a government which says we're not just prepared to let you be passively obedient, but we want you to voice your approval. This is such a phenomenon of modern dictatorship. Think of North Korea and think of the Cultural Revolution. This is all that was going on.
Applauding the NHS during lockdown.
Applauding the NHS during lockdown. All of these sorts of things. But you're quite right. That we don't have our conception of in a post-Freudian world. We don't have that place to go to that they had to go to. It's the sort of the thing they wanted to defend above all else. The thing that most mattered about us. It's gone.
Well, I'm a Christian in the church minister. There are some answers. But
there are some answers. Well, no, there aren't. Okay. No. I'm not. I'm an Anglican as well. So I mean, I still believe in that stuff, but most people don't. I mean, it's a pretty big ask nowadays, I think, especially in academia, right? But anyway, but that's very interesting.
Okay. Well. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for a fantastic lecture. Save the applause until the end. Just wanted to say thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to those at home who bore with us in spite of the technical problems. We don't usually have technical problems, so that was a one-off. And some great questions. And just a quick reminder, do, if you get a chance, buy Jeremy's excellent book, Travels with Tocqueville, beyond America, but also in America. Very good. Order it online, buy it in bookshops. And do join the Free Speech Union if you haven't joined already. And if you're around next Monday evening at the Hippodrome, I'll be talking to Nigel Farage on stage starting at 9, but doors open at 8 o'clock. And for the price of entry, £25, you get a free drink, and then there'll be drinks afterwards. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming. And in particular, thank you very much for our guest lecturer tonight, Professor Jeremy Jennings. Thank you.
I just say thank you, but obviously, if you buy my book, great. But buy Constant, buy Mill, and buy Tocqueville. Buy those first. If you've got a spare penny, buy my book. But read those three; they're great writers.